go ahead.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. I'm Wendy Myers. I'm one of the senior clinical managers at Cancer Bridges, and a licensed clinical social worker. And we welcome you to our Wednesday general meeting, which has been going on for almost 4 years. It's hard to believe. And we're so excited to bring you great speakers and wonderful open discussion on those opposite weeks that we do not have speakers. And know that this is a great place to be every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. if you have nothing to do or you're curious. So tonight we've kind of livened up our group a bit over the last several months or so, and we've been adding something Jen and I have always wanted to do, and Dr. Van London, who's on the call this evening as well, have chatted about doing book reviews. And there's so many amazing books out there and pertaining to many issues that we're all thinking about and wondering about. And so we've been doing this, and it's been very well received, and tonight we're continuing it. So tonight I'm going to pass it along to one of my colleagues to introduce Dr. Van London a little bit more, who's near and dear to our heart. And then Dr. Van London is going to introduce our guest speaker, who is a wonderful author, Brad Buchanan, on talking about his book, Living with Graft-Versus-Host Disease. So welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. If I haven't met you, I'm Jen Kim. I also work for Cancer Bridges, and I'm grateful to be here tonight. We have just such we adore Dr. Josie and everything she brings to the table. She has been an oncologist for multiple years, but is now for
just keep it short, okay?
Okay, all right. And then but we do. She adds so much to Cancer Bridges through many different programs, and the book talk is really cool. I know a lot of you really appreciate it as well as we do, because we get to meet the authors, which is kind of unusual. So it's a real joy. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Van London.
Thank you. Thank you, both Jen and Wendy and Brad. I'm very happy that you're here to talk about your books you've written. You've written this sort of memoir, and Brad has written poetry also, because he uses healing as writing as a healing method. And before we get started, I wanted to explain that Brad had some glitch in his schedule, and as a result, he will be commuting in the car, and so he will have his camera turned off, but his sound obviously is on. And we're all very familiar with how our life can sometimes change in a heartbeat. And so I asked Brad, shall we reschedule? And he said no, because I promised I would be here, and I will be here. And so that's the kind of man Brad is. Brad is a medically retired English professor in Sacramento, and he has survived 2 cancers. I put a timeline on it, actually. He was diagnosed with T-cell lymphoma in February of 2015, which is a lymph node cancer that eventually he needed to receive a stem cell transplant for a year later in February of 2016. Both of that was where he lives, is my understanding. But Brad, if I have something wrong, please correct me. But then sadly, he had developed a second cancer, which is a cancer in response to, we call it a post-transplant lymphoma, which can sometimes happen in those who undergo a transplant. And for that, he had to go to New York City to undergo treatment. And at this point, we're very happy that he's in remission from both cancers. But from the transplant, he received his cells from his brother. And as a result, he had pretty severe acute and now chronic graft-versus-host disease, where the cells from his brother that were infused are attacking both the lymphoma cells, which is good because that keeps the cancer under control, but is also attacking his own body, which is not so good because that gives you a lot of symptoms, autoimmune symptoms that he describes in the book, this book. And I have a ton of questions for Brad, and whether or not you have read the book or if questions pop up, as we are talking, feel free to ask Brad any questions, but I first wanted to go to Brad and ask him, Brad, did I say anything incorrectly?
No, you got it all down, I think pretty well, Josie. I will say I'm safely parked, waiting for my daughter to
Okay,
pick her up. So
okay,
I'm not,
that's good.
commuting sounds a little more hazardous than what I'm up to
Okay,
right now.
okay.
So, but anyway, yeah, sorry folks, I would love to be on camera and so forth, but this just isn't the best situation for me to be on camera right now.
That's okay, Brad. I wanted to ask you first, before we get started with the rest, how does it feel for you to talk about what you've been through before? Because I have a suspicion or a feeling that it might be somewhat triggering. Like, some of us don't really want to relive everything we've gone through. So I wanted to ask you, how does it feel as we talk about you and your book tonight?
It feels good, honestly.
Oh,
Yeah, this is sort of what I do. I wrote about my cancer, even before I was diagnosed. I kind of knew I had cancer. I just didn't know what it was. Then, I wrote about my stem cell transplant during the transplant itself. The night before I got my brother's stem cells, I was writing things, and so I've always kind of wanted to communicate, how it feels in the moment as I was going through the various phases. And then talking about graft-versus-host disease is really important to me because it's kind of it's a bit of a mystery illness in some ways. When I tell people, yeah, I'm done with cancer for the time being, fortunately, but I have another disease, they say, oh, really? And then when I tell them it's graft-versus-host disease, they just go, what? What the heck is that? And so I have to explain it all to them, and they nod and don't generally smile. But anyway, so yeah, I think it's really important to raise awareness about GVHD. And that's why I wrote the book that you're holding there, Josie, because there was no patient narrative account of GVHD in book form that I knew of anyway, prior to my writing and publishing that book. So, I'm a writer by nature, by temperament, and I'm very happy to speak about what I've written. I run writing workshops, as you've noted, where people are encouraged to write about difficult subjects and then talk about, the writing. And so, yeah, this is sort of what I do these days. I'm not teaching any longer. So this is what I do instead of teaching, I suppose. I raise awareness. I try to express how it felt, how it feels, and connect with other people who might be going through something similar to what I have gone through or am still going through.
Correct. Thank you, Brad. And there's so much in this book, by the way, that I had a really hard time prioritizing what to talk about today. So we'll see how it goes. But there's so much in here. You did so well, and I think part of why you did so well is, obviously you're an author, you're a writer, you're an English, words are your language. But secondly, you also wrote, you specifically brought a journal with you to write in the hospital room for all the treatments that you've been through, and then obviously when you went home until you couldn't, and that was really heartbreaking. And so that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. But if you feel it's too early, it's too early, maybe. I see there's somebody else joining. We're up to 12 people now. But Brad likes to write, and all of us, we obviously use our eyes. But then one of the side effects of Brad's disease as part of the graft-versus-host is that his eyes were starting to become involved to the point that he needed to have his eyes kept closed for it to heal. and be less symptomatic and allow the different potions and lotions to
Yeah.
stay in his eyes. And
Yes.
so that whole process on its own, can you imagine having somebody putz with your eyes and keeping them artificially closed with
Yeah.
sutures, which is
Yeah.
when I think about it, my stomach turns. Having somebody put sutures through your eyelids is like a medieval
Yeah.
torture method.
Yeah.
But on top of that, you couldn't write anymore. And that really, I think, took away one of your coping methods and one of your sort of your also a way to orient yourself to where am I right now.
Yeah.
That really helped you stay in the moment. And that I think illustrates the importance of a coping method and the harm it does when a coping method is not able
Yeah.
to be used. And we all have our own coping methods, but this is yours. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm jumping a little bit back and forth, but
Uh,
I thought that might be something for you to maybe talk about a little bit more.
yeah, sure. So yeah, my eye troubles were definitely an unexpected and severe side effect of my acute graft-versus-host disease. This is not something that normally happens, even with people who have a stage 4 GVHD, as I did. And it took a long time for anyone to understand what on earth was going on with my eyes. Um, yeah, I just started having these very sharp pains in my eyes. People thought it was conjunctivitis, pink eye, or what have you. And it seemed like dozens of ophthalmologists came into my hospital room to poke and prod my eyes and see what was going on there. And it took weeks actually before I was sort of packed up and sent to the head ophthalmologist at UC Davis Medical Center, who was the only person who had any experience whatsoever with ocular graft-versus-host disease, which is what I had. So yeah, I was functionally blind for about a year and a half. And the doctor who finally diagnosed me with ocular GVHD recommended the tarsorrhaphy, is what it's called, where they sewed an intricate system of little loops into my eyelids. It felt like something that would happen in a horror movie.
Yeah,
It,
that's what I mean. It's like a
it,
torture method.
it did not feel great at the time. And UC Davis is also a teaching hospital, so one of the doctors who sewed my eyelid shut was expert, and the other one was not expert and messed it up the first time, so they had to redo it later, which was extra excruciating. But yeah, I mean, uh, in the final analysis, my eye problems were kind of a sideline to my real predicament, which was that I had life-threatening acute graft-versus-host disease of the gastrointestinal tract. Um, I won't go into the details there because those two are pretty gross. But yeah, it got to the point where I simply couldn't and wouldn't eat for about 2 months or so. I had to be fed on in a tube, basically a bag of nutrition was hung from the IV tower and trickled into my veins that way. And it was hard to learn how to eat again after all of that came to pass. So yeah, there was about 6 months where I was just too sick. I was, as you say, visually impaired. I just couldn't write anything about what was going on with me or what had gone on with me. My mother, who was among my care team with my wife and my dad, she tried to, as I was home and recuperating sort of from all this, she was like, "Don't you have anything to say about all that experience? Like, you're a writer. Come on, let's go." Um, I mean, she was doing it with the best of intentions, and I had really nothing to offer for quite a long time. But eventually, part of the problem was I didn't adapt very well to my blindness. I never learned Braille, for instance. I was kind of in denial about my blindness. I thought, oh, this is just a temporary thing. It'll go away. I had little slivers of vision at the very edges of my eyesight, because what had happened was my corneas had been scratched up by the acute GVHD. So it was actually a very superficial damage to the eyeball. And eventually they could tell that underneath the corneas, everything was okay. So that I did regain vision pretty fully after corneal transplants, which is where they cut out that portion of my eye and sew in another sewing activity. Fortunately for this, I was unconscious, unlike with the tarsorrhaphy. Anyway, so they sewed in corneas from a donor corpse into my eyes, and it healed up okay. And so I did have usable vision again because of that type of transplant. So yeah, it was quite an ordeal, and it was really hard to put any of that into words for a long time. Finally, I did come up with 3 words about the worst of my days with acute GVHD, and those 3 words were crouched over darkness. That's what I finally gave my mom, by way of that's what I was up to for those weeks. I was in the hospital for 139 days for my transplant, and wasn't sure I would ever get home again. So yeah, finally I did, produce 3 words. I finally did adapt to my visual impairment by devolving a writing system of sorts. I would write huge dark characters on a piece of paper, maybe 10 words to a page. I couldn't read what I'd written, but I knew something was there, where I made a mark of some kind. So I hired a college student actually to type in these. Eventually I started to write poems and they were all about blindness actually. I couldn't write about Graft-Versus-Host Disease yet. The disease is such a paradoxical kind of thing, where it's the disease you get instead of cancer that in some ways protects you from cancer too. It's encoded into your DNA. There's no way to fight it or excise it from your body, unlike some cancers. All they could do is give me a bunch of prednisone, treat it with something called ECP, extracorporeal photopheresis, and gradually sort of manage the worst of the GVHD symptoms so that I could get well enough again that I, said, okay, I'll start eating, and trust that the food was not just going to rocket through my body out the other end, in a matter of seconds, which it was doing for a while. And slowly but surely, 100, I had more than 100 treatments of photopheresis over the course of the next 7 years or so. But yeah, writing was tough in those times, but I finally did devise a way to write at least about my blindness, which in some ways was an easier topic to tackle than GVHD.
I think, Brad, you were doing a stem cell transplant in general is not a joke. It's a pretty serious intervention, but what Brad experienced is rather unique. He had a very severe case of graft-versus-host disease. So I don't want anybody here who is about to undergo a transplant this story for them to scare them off. I don't want that. It's supposed to be enlightening, empowering, because there's different learning pearls in Brad's book.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. I 100% feel the same way, Dr. Josie. And honestly, though, as you say, my transplant entailed some unexpectedly severe side effects, I would do it again 100%, at the same institution even that I had it. And yeah, I wrote the book. My oncologist said at the time, you might scare people away actually from getting the transplants that they need. And so I've tried to say in the book and say every time I talk about the book
Oh, that's why you
that
did that. Yeah, because
uh,
you do
yeah,
stress that in several parts of the
yeah,
book that you will do it again
yeah.
in a heart.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, of course. Yeah,
So
because I
that's
know,
why.
I 100% know that I needed that transplant. Um, and I believe it's kind of a medical miracle that, stem cell transplants are even possible.
Yeah.
Um, I'm starting to learn more about the history of the research that led up to this amazing idea that you could transplant someone's immune system into someone else. Anyway, just a marvel of human ingenuity. I just got unlucky, honestly. I had the gold standard donor, a younger male sibling, my brother James. But for some reason or other, maybe it was because he got some weird tropical disease that didn't show up on the DNA test or what have you. His immune system just kind of lashed out. Maybe he was. I sometimes joke, that he's getting his revenge for all the times I mocked him or bullied him or whatever when we were kids, and I was the older sibling. But yeah, a transplant is the gold standard for treatment of the type of cancer that I had, and I would 100% do the same again. And I I just felt like GVHD needs to be talked about more openly and not kept as a kind
Mhm.
of little secret, or minimized to people who have it. Okay, and not. I think we need to treat people going into transplant as adults and say, here are the possible consequences. It can be fatal. It can be very severe, but you 100% stand a better chance of surviving with a transplant than you would without it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that, weighing the benefits with the risks. There's a few things you just touched on, and one I really thought was funny almost, but probably not for you in the moment. You were hospitalized a day before, I guess, your brother was going to donate the cells, and your brother was flying in, and you had all these thoughts. What if his
Oh
flight
yeah,
won't arrive? What if,
yeah,
because that's very real. You underwent
yeah,
all your preparation.
yeah,
You underwent the treatment to eradicate your bone marrow, so it's ready to receive your brother's bone marrow. And what if your
yeah,
brother doesn't come? I
yeah.
mean, that is
Exactly.
you wrote is very selfish. I guess it is selfish, but it's also sort of like a matter of
Yeah.
life and death. The
Well,
other go ahead.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and that, like, I was actually admitted to the hospital on January 3rd, and I only got his stem cells on the January 11th. There were 8 days of intensive total body irradiation that I received, and then a huge blast of chemotherapy again as well, just to wipe out my immune system completely. I chose that, slightly more violent form of the stem cell transplant process because I felt that anything short of that would not get rid of my cancer. That was my oncologist's opinion
Yeah.
anyway. So we had to do that. And uh, the nurse coordinator who orchestrated the transplant, gave my brother a pretty stern speech ahead of time. She said, eventually Brad's going to get to the point of no return, where if he doesn't get your stem cells, he will die. And my brother relayed that to me, a few months or whatever it was, not months, but maybe a couple of weeks before I went in. And that just kind of preyed on my mind is, yeah, like, they're going to take me past the point of being able to survive without a new immune system in my body. And then he's going to have to come and rescue me, basically, is how it felt. and he did.
Well, that's how it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
In some aggressive forms of blood cancer, you need to be blasting somebody with treatments to really kill all the tumor cells. The hope is that it does that, and
yep,
rescue with someone else's immune
yep,
bone marrow cells
yep,
to give them the ability to live in the world and fight infections, and also sometimes we want that graft versus lymphoma effect where these stem cells from a donor
right. Yeah,
fighter cancer.
yeah,
And so that's all very delicately balanced. And if it's, you know,
sure.
experts need to do this, and so there's only transplants being done in certain centers, and I guess Brett was lucky that his is in his backyard. Some
Yeah,
people need to travel very far to have this done. um but as we were talking about this, I think there's a lot of things that Brett has been through, and that all of us cancer survivors have been through, that can be very traumatizing, like having this cancer take over, going through certain procedures that are super scary, um uncertain what the outcome is,
yeah,
being in the dark literally if your eyeballs are closed. I guess all of you get the picture that there is a lot of psychological torture here too, and at some point Brad became a little confused from all the medications he was on,
yeah,
and he became a little what we call delirious. And so it's not
yeah,
surprising that besides the physical after effects, there's also significant emotional after effects that interfered with his ability to do anything, even writing. And most of us here know it takes a while for you to recover some of the things that you've lost. And it took a while for Brett. And Brett, I wanted to go to your subtitle.
yeah.
The subtitle of your book says "How I Stopped Fighting Cancer and I Started Healing." I don't know if you wanted to comment a little bit on that,
Yeah,
because I thought that's very interesting you picked that subtitle.
yeah. Well, there's a chapter in the book that's really all about the kind of cancer warrior mentality that I had to adopt,
Yeah.
because I was terrified, of course, as anyone would be, but I was also unusually squeamish, I think you could say, and tended to pass out um, when I was about to get a blood test, and just had a very
Did we lose you?
no, I'm still here. Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
I had a very frightening session of sort of informational and an orientation session before I began chemo, where I got like clammy palms. I broke out in sweat. I felt like I was going to faint. I had to go sit in the hallway, in fact, while my wife listened to the rest of the briefing. So I kind of needed that cancer warrior mentality to go in and say, I'm going to fight this cancer. It's going to kill me or I'm going to kill it, and so on and so forth. And
Like you
honestly,
military language.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And that is a that's a pretty conventional feature of cancer discourse in this country, um, as it is in probably lots of other countries too. But dealing with an illness like graft versus host disease, that approach, that language, the violent language of needing to fight and kill cancer and so forth, that just didn't apply to GVHD, because it's the result of a change in your genetic identity. Your DNA is altered as a result of the kind of stem cell transplant that I had. So there's no way to fight that alteration. All you can do is to manage the symptoms, to cope as best you can um, with a disorder that's really kind of it's who you are in some respects, because it's part of your now altered DNA. So I kind of take the reader through, the necessary psyching up, of going in to do battle with cancer. I wrote lots of poems that were like metaphors, uh, bombing. At one point, my oncologist said, we need to take an aggressive approach with your cancer. And, I likened it to throwing a Molotov cocktail. I had to change that mentality when it came to healing from the consequences of my transplant. The warrior mindset taps into your fight or flight reflexes, or freeze reflexes. And that's not where healing happens. Healing happens in your paras, as I've been learning through my subsequent readings in this. I've had to do a lot of reading in books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Just a fantastic book that kind of explains a lot of my shutting down after my transplant. I was sort of in what he calls the reptile brain, which after prolonged trauma or after prolonged, severe illness, you just kind of shut down. You say, please make it go away. You don't have the energy to fight. You don't have the energy to do anything anymore. You just kind of sit there like a deer in the headlights. And so anyway, that's, I had to stop fighting because there was nothing to fight against with graft-versus-host disease. And it was only when I stopped being in that mentality that I could start tapping into the healing emotions that writing helped to bring out. And I really do believe that engaging with the emotions surrounding your medical traumas or any kind of traumas is necessary to heal properly from them and to heal fully from them. They're what make us resilient in the long run.
Yeah, no, you can hear me. Yeah, I like how you explained that, Brad, and I saw a lot of people in the audience shaking their heads that they recognized what you've gone through. And I liked, thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
I have a few more things that I could go into. But I also wanted to see, maybe let's pause here in terms of me firing, to stay in the same language, firing questions at you and like a military firing squad. Let's see what other people here, if they have any questions. If not, don't worry, no pressure here. Then I will just keep asking my questions. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for Brad?
This is Ramona, and I
Oh,
have just one question. Being a writer requires a lot of what I'd call cognitive load.
yeah.
That you really use that brain, and having chemo and just being as sick as you were really challenges the ability to use that brain. And yet your writing is excellent. So what did you go
thank
through
you.
and how did you get there?
Thank you, Ramona. Well, yeah, I definitely had cognitive challenges after chemotherapy and my transplant. So it took me a while to feel like I trusted myself in some ways to write. I mean, fortunately, I think for most people, and I'm not an expert, but fortunately, the effects of quote unquote chemo brain are reversible. And at least in my case, they were temporary. The things I started to write after my transplant, I don't think were my finest literary efforts, but the message I want to convey about writing as healing is it doesn't have to have literary merit to be therapeutic to you. And this is why I facilitate writing workshops where I only offer positive feedback on each other's writing, because we know that even if something is written in a style that maybe we don't happen to admire or whatever, that writing that thing was important for the writer in that moment. And in writing one's truth, however basic the language or however, impaired the cognition that produces it, and indeed my cognition was impaired. Who knows, maybe it's still being impaired. Hard to say. That's the writing that needs to happen for that person at that time. And so I've kind of thrown out my old conceptions of literary value, which I, as an English professor, grading students' creative writing, I cringe now to think about it, but I used to do that. I would try to evaluate, what they had written against the standard of literary excellence that I thought I kind of was the guardian or gatekeeper of that. And I think about it now, and I'm just like, oh, I probably discouraged them from ever attempting writing again, some of them. So, yeah, I guess I'm here to bear the message that chemo brain is, I think, generally temporary. It was for me, as far as I know. Again, some people of my acquaintance might differ. But in any event, writing can, I think, help at whatever stage of recovery one happens to be from that cognitive impairment that chemo can sometimes produce.
Yeah,
But anyway,
that's
great question, and thank you.
That's what I was thinking, Brad. I wondered if your insistence on writing somehow made a difference for your cognitive recovery. I don't know. I don't think we will ever figure out in our lifetime. Yeah. Does
Yeah.
this answer help you, Ramona? Okay, I think she's saying yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think it does, and it also suggests that the fact that Brad was willing to push himself, the comment you made about in your recovery, it may actually have played a role in exercise, like any exercise, cognitive exercise.
Correct.
You were good, yeah. May
Mhm.
have been a key to how you were able to get yourself back to that ability to write like that. Or maybe to create a new ability to write at a level that you didn't write before.
Oh, I don't know, Brad. I don't know.
I don't
Brad,
know.
that
I
was
think that having lived through that experience may have created an empathy or a level of empathy that
Yeah.
at a level that you could tell things or say things you couldn't have said.
Well, I've certainly lost any and all inhibitions about writing. That's for sure. Yeah, there's stuff in the book my relatives might cringe at, but honestly, yeah, I write about erectile dysfunction in the book. Very common side effect of, severe chemotherapy and radiation. That's just how it is. And, I take comfort from a wonderful poet, John Keats, who wrote, "Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." In other words, if you say what is true for you, that is beautiful. If it seems so to you and to other people, if it resonates with them, then it will have meaning. And honestly, I there's a lot of anxiety these days in the writing world about AI taking over our task as writers. But my view and my response to that is to say, well, writing is important to us, not because it's an ideal combination of words, but because we are embodied creatures who are expressing how it feels to be embodied. And no robot can ever do that for us.
I like that. You should write a piece to the New York Times, an opinion piece or something like that.
Well, it's good. It'll be in my next book. I'm researching and
Okay.
writing another book about writing as healing and all the kinds of things we're talking about today. So that'll be a that'll be a chapter in that book.
So we're doing good on time. I apologize, I'm a little scattered, but it's really hard to nail this book in an hour. In the chat, I put a link to Brad's writing as healing descriptions. That is on the West Coast, but I also put a link to a session he will do with us on Saturday mornings on the East Coast, which is March 23rd, I believe, at our time, 11:15 a.m. It's all for free. And then Brad will lead that session, an hour long. Writing is healing. I also put in the link in the chat, a link to the book that Brad referred to, The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk, which is a rather dense book, but it's very easy to read, and you could just, there's some repetition there. You could just focus on the chapters that are relevant to you, but the gist of his book is that sometimes when we've had psychological trauma, we may not remember per se. And one of the ways that we might remember is by working with our body physically, because our body physically holds the score. It may trigger memories. So sometimes when you, for example, go to myofascial therapy, I don't know if many of you know what that is, sort of a medical massage where they ease your tightness that you all may have when you've been traumatized. If they work on you to ease those tight spots in your body that are ready to fight, it may trigger memories that then you take to your therapist to continue to talk about it and try to rewrite your story, the pieces that you may have lost, and give them a place and heal from them as far as you can heal from trauma. I don't know if it makes sense, but the book is all about the fact that your body, physical body, can help you heal. It holds memories. Anyway, that's a lot of detail that may not be relevant to today. Thank you, Ramona. You triggered a large discussion here. What did you want to say,
no, it's
Brett?
a great question. And
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on what you've just said, Josie. Like, yeah, since I've been through all this, I decided to overcome my inhibitions about getting a massage. And believe me, I desperately needed many massages to kind of reconnect with my body. One of the things that GVHD patients often say is, I feel like my body is no longer mine, that it's like a collection of badly assembled body parts like Frankenstein's monster. And that was absolutely how I felt. I felt like it was just a disconnected series of, organs and limbs that just didn't make sense any longer, because there was no feeling that sort of there was no good feeling uniting them. And massage was an important way for me to kind of inhabit my body, to accept its limitations. I have basically, embraced the truth that I am disabled as a result of my illnesses and as a result of what GVHD and the treatments for cancer have done to it. I also have done a lot of therapy, including therapy with EMDR treatments, which is a stimulation of the brain on both sides through eye movement and sometimes involving, for me, it involved also music that would sort of engage both sides of the brain while we talked about trauma.
and so forth. So yeah, and I've written about those things too, because you can recreate the moments of insight that you get from therapy, you get from massages, or that you get from music. You can retell those stories in writing too, and kind of reshape those back into the narrative that you're talking about, Josie. One of the things I'm learning in my research for this upcoming book is that telling a narrative where you accept your own transformation of your illness and kind of give it a positive construction if you possibly can. Some of us can't because it was just too painful and left us damaged. But I'm doing my best to shape narratives of my life that don't deny what's happened to me and my body, but to cast it in a light where the transformation has some positive aspects to it, which it certainly has. I mean, for one thing, I get to claim status as a genetic chimera, a mythical monster that the people who came up with the stem cell transplant decided that they would use that word as a medical term to describe people who've had their DNA altered in the fashion that I've had by this type of transplant. So
and that means in the most acute sense, I guess, all these ancestry tests that you see everywhere, where you just spit in a tube and you send it to see if you have family members on the planet, that won't work for Brad anymore because his DNA is altered. Although in his case, he was donated by his brother, but if you're donated by a random stranger,
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it also raises interesting criminal questions, for evidentiary purposes. If you leave DNA at the scene, if it's like someone else's DNA, partly. Anyway, there's mystery novels to be written about that.
Yeah, I think so. Brad, I wanted to say something else, and then I'll ask if anybody has another question. By the way, are we triggering anybody here? Did anything of what we're talking about here today, is that triggering you, making you get the Heber creepers? Okay, you will tell us though if it is, right? Because we can pause it. And so I think what Brad is going through will resonate with a lot of you to some degree. I think what Brad went through is maybe a very extreme case, but I think most of you resonate with that. And we discussed the last topic he brought up is how he doesn't recognize what he is. But he also struggled, Brad, you also struggled with who am I and what makes me me, which I liked. You picked those words. What makes me, sort of an existential question, which brings you to what you started to talk about, grief. And the final stage of grieving is finding meaning and purpose in whatever bad you went through, which some of us can and some of us cannot. But I guess those are all struggles and questions that you ask yourself as you're trying to heal and maybe transcend to a higher level of your being, I guess. Would you like to expand a little bit on that, or is that too much to do?
No, I'm happy to.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, at various points in my medical odyssey, I was told you're probably going to die within X number of weeks, months, days, whatever. There was one when I was diagnosed with my second type of blood cancer. My oncologist said, "Yeah, you have about a year to live." Fortunately, he revised that opinion after going to a conference where he heard about a clinical trial for people in my exact situation. And, here I am today. So he was wrong. But the clinical trial proved as effective as advertised. But anyway, to get back to your question, I did a lot of grieving during my illness because I felt like, yeah, part of me is going to be forever gone as a result of this this medical ordeal. There were times where I thought I'm simply going to cease to exist. So I had to, I spent a lot of time walking around Sacramento, coming to terms with that, walking to the local cemetery. I picked out a spot, in fact, paid for it, made arrangements, wrote the will, the advance directive, all that stuff. So I kind of mourned for myself and my life as I was going through all these things, because it would have been kind of irresponsible to ignore the strong likelihood anyway that I was going to die. And in a way, that radical acceptance of the immediate, clear and present danger of death freed me up to live in the moment fully, after I had done that work of mourning in real time. So I don't, I do grieve certain things these days. Like, I grieve the end of my marriage, which I think can be the end. The marriage was really badly affected by all my medical ups and downs. Yeah, I grieve the end of my career. I, could have reasonably expected to teach at Sacramento State for another 20 years or so, but that was all curtailed due to illness. But I don't grieve for who I am today because I am different, and I have a future that is different from the person who was thinking about his life 15 years ago. But I kind of mourned that person some time ago. I didn't know what I would become next, but I'm glad I became someone, even if that someone's rather different than who I expected to be at this point. But and honestly, that's my, people have a tendency to come to me and talk when they've received a very bad bit of medical news, and the first thing I tell them, if they want any advice, is I say, you need to radically accept that you're going to die. You just have to come to terms with that straight up right now. And I mean, we all will die sooner or later. But putting that on the front burner and not denying it is very important, because then it frees you up later on to come to terms with whatever may be happening. To sort of make your peace with the idea of death is job one for people in truly dire medical predicaments, as I was.
Thank you, Brad. I wanted to ask the group if do they have any questions about this, or in general, any questions? We covered a lot today.
I just have to thank you, Brad. I am the therapist actually at Cancer Bridges. We didn't get a chance for me to introduce myself before we hopped on here. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have been doing this about 33 years. And what you've said is just absolutely, correct, on multiple levels, obviously from your own standpoint of view, but in general. And I always say we have to address the elephant in the room first, and that is the ability to talk about the hard stuff, but that hope and reality can, they can live together. And that once you, be able to do all the logistical things and talk about all of those emotional things of loss, because it is all loss, you're right, totally grief work. Then you can move on with hope and a sense of purpose. And what do I do now? How do I set intentions going forward to be able to, find my way, because I'm alive. and have a life worth living. So thank you so much for your courage and your wisdom and your knowledge to be able to help others and to live a life with purpose. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, purpose is really important for anyone, and especially for people who've had, medical catastrophes befall them. I have to reconceive of my life as having a different purpose than I might have chosen, if I had had my druthers. But here I am, and I absolutely embrace the purpose that I've been given.
Brad, before we split, there's a question if you can explain what the Writing is Healing workshop entails. Would you be able to explain that in 1 or 2 minutes?
Sure. Yeah. So the way it works is the facilitator gives a prompt. In my case, I usually present a poem with a theme. The prompt is always optional, though, and if someone wants to write about something different, whatever just happened to them, that is 100% okay. And then we write to that for a certain amount of time. We get positive feedback, and then if there's time, we write again. So that's sort of what we're up to. And I do these with blind writers, with cancer center writers, but anyone is welcome. We don't check people's credentials at the door.
And you don't have to share. There's some participants who write
Correct.
but don't share.
Yeah, it's always optional.
Yep.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Only positive feedback, so you don't have to be afraid that you're going to be burned down to the ground.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
we try to be very supportive of everybody.
Yes, and surprisingly, we've had several times, and Brett has done this many more times than I have, but we've had some people really feel what they write and have an emotional reaction. And so I put the link in the thing. I think it's also on Cancer Bridges calendar, but sometimes it falls off. That's why I'm giving you the direct link. That's my website, the link for March's session with Brad on the East Coast. On the West Coast, it's like our midnight, which is for me a little too late to still write something. But this is our Eastern Coast morning time. Brad, I really enjoyed having you here. We miss seeing your face. But I let me see if your face is in the book. Here. This is Brad. We can show your face this way. And it was, oh, there he is. Oh, you look the same. Okay, fine. That's Brad. And I'm really happy that we got to do it today, and to be continued. Hopefully I'll see you all next month with the next author chat, which is Liz O'Riordan, who is a British breast cancer surgeon who writes about her own breast cancer experience, which is breast cancer specific. But just like with Brad, there's a lot of things that are applicable across the board to other tumor types. You don't have to have the book read. And it looks like in April, Brad, you don't know this yet because it just developed today, but your wife may come on in April. I think what
Okay. Great.
April 17th, I think it is. April 17th is a Wednesday in April at 6 p.m. our time, where she will talk about her book Already Toast, which describes her burnout related to caregiving for Brett. And
Yep.
I will talk with you, Brett. Brett and his wife are still amicable. They're
Yes.
separated on friendly terms, so I can say that
Yes.
here.
Yeah.
But not every marriage survives a big ordeal like this, which is sad. But to be continued, Brad. I will stay in touch with you, and hopefully I see all of you next, plus the cat, Ramona and the cat too next month. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you, Josie, and thanks everyone.
Big hugs. Thank you.